Can we get that door? Oh, hello. There's my eye contact again.
Copy the link.
Anything else, sir? Would you like,
Oh, this is good.
I don't know, gold-plated, sandwiches? Where's the-
No one in the, no one pending.
No one in the.
No one in the-
Okay, okay. You want us to join?
What's the draft?
I
Now,
think we sent out,
I have it here. I have the link now, the YouTube link. Wallah, I'm making progress. I have the live stream link.
Is this not the right one? It's not turning on.
It's not select, fully select. Is it fully select?
Hi.
hello.
Kawasi.
Okay.
I'm good, how are
Hello.
you?
I heard that one. That was nice.
Huh. This is
Can
very loud.
you,
Mhm.
can you move back a little bit, Teacher Joanne?
Oh,
Which one, which group has everyone?
I need something. to
Good
Put
mom.
under, because I want it to come from top, not from bottom.
Okay, now we're ready to start. It's live streaming now.
Have we started already? Is it already started?
Juwaria is performing surgery here. I get taken care of here, so it's nice.
How does it look? What else from your side?
No,
How does, how do
Just
you?
a second.
do it look?
it's. Yes, I can. The live, the link is.
Much better, yes.
Okay, should we start? Is recording?
Yeah. It's recording.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our second session of In the Footsteps of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam.
Salam.
And without further ado, Ustaz Jawad Khan is here to give his reflections.
Thank you so much, Mariam, and Assalamualaikum, everybody. And this is the second session and lecture about Tariq Ramadan's In the Footsteps of the Prophet. So the first session that we had addressed his reasons for writing the book and addressing that there have so many different biographies. Why would there be another biography about the Prophet ﷺ? And so last time we talked about the things that we can glean from his life and the philosophy of the faith about why the things happened the way that they did. And so today, inshallah, we're going to spend about an hour discussing the next portion, which is his early life, his life before Makkah, before prophethood in Makkah, and his early days when he first received revelation. So in many ways, if you look at Tariq Ramadan's his writings, both in the footsteps of the Prophet and in other writings that he has, you see a great influence that he has from one of the great Muslim intellectuals and philosophers and writers, Ismail Farouqi. And Ismail Farouqi, he said that the essence of religious experience in Islam, we may say in conclusion, is the realization that life is not in vain, that it must serve a purpose, the nature of which cannot be identical with the natural flow of appetite to satisfaction, to new appetite, and new satisfaction. For the Muslim, reality consists of two utterly disparate orders, the natural and the transcendent. And it is the latter, i.e., the transcendent, that he looks for the values by which to govern the flow of the former. Having identified the transcendent realm as God, he rules out any guidance of action that does not proceed therefrom. His rigorous tawheed is, in final analysis, a refusal to subject human life to any guidance other than the ethical. And in chapter 2 and in chapter 3 in the footsteps, Tariq Ramadan, he lays out the philosophical foundation about the ethos of Islam, about why the edicts that would build upon when we get to the final lecture, when the Muslims were in Medina, why the reason for the things they were the way that they were. And he has, there's so much to choose from, and we can only address some of those things. But he starts off in chapter 2, and he talks about the situation of the Prophet ﷺ. So the Prophet ﷺ, his mother, Amina, was 2 months pregnant with him when his father, Abdullah, passed away. And so this set up a dichotomy for the Prophet ﷺ, peace and blessings be upon him, because what we had were two different things. We had a person who had lost his father. And in that milieu in Makkah at that time, having lost your father puts you at a great disadvantage in life. But at the same time, he was from a noble clan, one of the noble clans of Makkah, the Quraysh. And so he had both of these factors with him. And so Tariq Ramadan, he writes about how this education, this way that he grew, was, as we mentioned in the first lecture, chosen before anything ever happened, that it was meant to be this way, but will give the Prophet ﷺ an education in the ways of being without and of wanting. And then that the early Meccan surahs that we saw detail that and outline that. We understand that when he was sent out into the desert, and that he was without a father, and that it was difficult to find somebody who was going to be a wet nurse for him, because he was an orphan, he did not have a father. And Tariq Ramadan, he cites a surah, Ad-Duha, that would come down later, but it would outline some of these things that the Prophet ﷺ had experienced and then that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given to him. And he said, in the closest meaning, did he not find thee an orphan and give thee shelter? And he found thee wandering and he gave thee guidance. And he found thee in need and made thee independent. Therefore, treat not the orphan with harshness, nor repulse the petitioner who asks, but the bounty of thy Lord rehearse and proclaim. And so the early life of the Prophet ﷺ, and then how he had to be completely dependent upon God to take care of him, made plain there why the commandments and the edicts in this milieu in Makkah were sent down. Umar ibn Khattab, may Allah be pleased with him, and he said that the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, said, if you were to rely upon Allah with reliance only on him, he would provide for you just as he provides for the birds. They go out in the morning with empty stomachs and they return full. Tariq Ramadan, he outlines in these verses some of the things that the Prophet ﷺ he faced. And these things included his vulnerability. and then that he was close to the poor. Many of the first people who had converted to Islam in Mecca, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, about why it's so significant, that they were poor, that they were not of the ones who were powerful. And this was the teaching about why the people came drawn to Islam. And we'll speak about this here in just a second. And then that the Prophet ﷺ would have empathy for the people who were without in a society that dealt with people who were not protected in a powerful clan or had means and resources, that they were dealt with harshly. So he learned this in this, and this was the education, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in just a second. And Ramadan, he goes on to cite one of the modern philosophers. His name is John Rawls. And John Rawls, he came up with this idea of something called the veil of ignorance. And he said to create a perfect society, you would have to take everyone out of whatever he or she lives in. So if you were a CEO, you wouldn't be a CEO anymore. If you were a single mother, you wouldn't be a single mother anymore. Whether you were white or you were black or you were this or that, you would be taken out. And there'd be a veil of ignorance that's put in front of you. And in this veil of ignorance, you would then create a world not knowing what you would go back into as. So you want to create a society that, regardless of what you were put back into, that would be fair for you. But the only way we do it is to take out our own self, because then we have biases towards our own self. And so Ramadan cites that later on what happened in Medina, that the society that was established there was this based on creating a perfect society. That whether you were someone who was wealthy and owned a farm and owned date orchards, or whether you were an orphan, or whether you were mentally incapacitated, or that you were a widow, that you would be taken care of. And then Ramadan goes on to write that the desert is often the locus of prophecies because it naturally offers to the human gaze the horizons of the infinite. And so what does this mean? He talks about the nomads. The nomads, the Bedouin desert dwellers, they did not get an attachment to anything because things for them were fleeting and ephemeral. And they were here now, but they were gone. So there was not this attachment. And then Ramadan talks about how these early years in the Prophet ﷺ's life, that when you're in the desert, you look up into the infinite, out into space, and you see how insignificant one person is. And then that our ego, our natural ego, becomes lessened and dampened. Because we see we are this tiny spot on this one planet amongst this multitude of stars. And you see that in the desert because there's nothing there that blocks it. You see out into the infinite horizon. And this was the education that he had. And he goes on and he cites, there's a beautiful saying by one of the Native American chiefs. His name was Chief Crowfoot. And he was on the border of Canada and the United States. And he had been taken apart multiple different times, and his nation had been taken apart multiple times, used by the United States, used by Canada as well. And so they asked him about this treatment of being treated unfairly. And he had one of the great quotes about the ephemeral nature of life, which we're going to make parallel again towards the end of the lecture. He said, "What is life? It is the flash of a firefly in the night. It is the breath of a buffalo in the wintertime. It is the little shadow which runs across the grass and loses itself in the sunset." So Ramadan discusses in these early chapters this life that the Prophet ﷺ had in the desert and in the infinite, and about how it grounded him in the way that he was going to look at the rest of the world. he gives a very interesting story, Tariq Ramadan, and he talks about how at the time in Mecca that the chieftains and the people of Quraysh, when they celebrated with excess in drinking and in revelry. And so Ramadan, he gives a very interesting take on a hadith, that story that many of you probably heard, and that this was before prophethood. And so the Prophet ﷺ, peace and blessings be upon him, he hears about a wedding that's going to happen in Mecca. And so at this time, it was going to be celebrated heavily. And so the Prophet ﷺ, he says that on his way to the wedding, he gets sleepy and he gets drowsy and he becomes overcome with drowsiness. So he falls asleep. And then he wakes up the next day. So he's missed the wedding. And at that wedding was an extreme amount of revelry and drunkenness. And so Tariq Ramadan, he gives a very interesting interpretation about how he was educated. And he says that while gentleness and diversion were used to protect him, those events which the Prophet was later to mention gradually built in him a moral sense shaped through the understanding of those signs and of what they protected him from. This natural initiation into morals remote from any obsession with sin and fostering of guilt greatly influenced the kind of education the Prophet was to impart to the companions. With the teaching method relying on gentleness, on the common sense of individuals, and on their understanding of commands, the Prophet also strove to teach them how to put their instincts to sleep, so to speak, and how to resort to diversion to escape evil temptations. For those companions, as for us in all ages and societies, this teaching method is most valuable and reminds us that a moral sense should be developed not through interdiction and sanction, but gradually, gently, exactingly, understandingly, and at a deep level. So if you look throughout the seerah, the life of the Prophet, and if you look throughout about the way that he taught the companions, this became imbued in the way the companions taught each other. Those of you who are familiar with the hadith and the stories of the Prophet ﷺ, you'll notice that when the companions talk about something good that they did, they'll mention the name of the person. So-and-so did something. But when somebody did something bad, they never mention the name. Now, they know who did it. We know who did it, but they won't mention the name because they're giving their fellow companions the benefit of the doubt. And this was something that was learned from the way that the Prophet ﷺ taught. We'll mention in one of the stories in the last lecture about when the people of Medina, when the hypocrites in Medina, they sought to question the reputation of Aisha, may Allah be pleased with her, the wife of the Prophet, ﷺ, that when they talked about who did this, they would keep the names away from the people, so it's not recorded in history. When we learn about the expedition, about the people who stayed behind, and about how at that time somebody would say, this person stayed behind because he was selfish or whatever, but that name's not mentioned because it's not an interdiction of guilt that they were taught through, but rather they were taught through this gentleness of leaving this instinct that we have, that the nafs has, that the heart has, of wanting to do certain things to a higher plane. That's the transcendent that Ismail Farouqi said in that quote that we read at the beginning. So this is a very interesting point that Ramadan, and the book is full of these interesting different looks at what happened than what we commonly read. So I wanted to mention that. So chapter 3. Now chapter 3 starts off with one of the most interesting stories in the life of the Prophet ﷺ before prophethood. And in this story has great meaning for the way we interpret Islam today. So what happened was this. in the period before prophethood, there was a battle that was going on between multiple tribes. And in this case, especially, this was a battle over prestige, old grudges, trade routes between the Hawazin and the Quraysh. And so there was a lot of internecine battles. There was a lot of these battles that happened. And the Quraysh, they looked at this and they thought, this isn't good, because they went to Syria and they went to Abyssinia, and they saw that some of these places didn't have these squabbles that they had amongst their tribes. And so they thought, well, maybe there has to be a better way. But we know that the system of justice in Mecca, just as the system of someone who's going to be taken care of, was the same. The system of justice was that might makes right. And that whichever tribe that you belong to, if that tribe could protect you or provide interdiction for you and intercede for you in between others, then you would have recourse. And if you didn't, then you didn't. So there wasn't a universal right or wrong. So what happened was that there was a Yemeni merchant. And so this Yemeni merchant, he had sold something to one of the chieftains in Mecca. And so the chieftain in Mecca had bought something, and he told the Yemeni merchant that I'm going to pay you later. So he didn't. Now, today, I suppose it could be sent to collections or whatever else, right? Now, what were you going to do back then if the person didn't want to pay? So the Yemeni merchant had no recourse because he had no one in Mecca. And so the chieftain kept on saying, well, I'll pay you, I'll pay you, I'll pay you. Eventually, he didn't pay him. Now, what's he going to go do? So he petitioned to the tribes in Mecca, and they came together and they created something called the Hilf al-Fudul, the league or the pact or the group of the virtuous. And so what they decided was that they were going to respect the principles of justice and collectively intervene in conflicts to establish justice, not based on which tribe you were from or who could protect you, but a sense of universal right or wrong. Now, there's something that the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, said that's very, very important into how we interpret things that can be accepted into the faith. And so the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, he said that this pact of the virtuous, the Hilf al-Fudul, he said, was so excellent that I would not exchange my part in it for a herd of red camels. And if now in Islam, so this was after revelation started. So the revelation had already started. And he said, if now in Islam I was asked to take part in it, I would be glad to accept. Now, the people who created the pact, they were non-Muslims, right? Islam had not been sent down. They were idolaters. They were idol worshippers. But they wanted to seek out something that was justice. So the Prophet ﷺ, he said, I would take part on it now, even after revelation had started. So the edicts and the values and the mores of Islam had started, but he said, I would still take part in it. So Ramadan, he delineates 3 different things that is important in this. So he says, 1, Islam embraces values derived from the human conscious and that are outside of strictly Islamic tradition. Now, this does not contradict the fact that at the end, when all of revelation happened, that Islam was a perfect way of being. A perfect way of being and living. That doesn't contradict that. What it does say is that the Prophet ﷺ said that he would go towards something that's good, even if it wasn't initiated by people within Islam. Now, there's a lot of people who say that there is, and it's a fallacy, that an either or fallacy, right? The fallacy of dichotomy that says that you can't be Muslim and you can't be something else either, but you can be. The Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, they had a survey and they asked Americans, so, can somebody be a fully practicing Muslim, believe in Islam, and can they also be fully American? And there was a large percentage of the people, more than 40%, who said no, they can't. Because there's this idea that the two ideals cannot coexist. But the values of justice and of doing something right and from human conscience are accepted. And that's proven by the Prophet ﷺ saying that even after revelation came down, that I would take part in the Hilf al-Fudul if it happened again. And so that proves that regardless, that I would still want to take part in this. So if somebody is going to do something good and it doesn't come, it comes from somebody else, the Muslims can partner with that. It doesn't mean that that idea doesn't have to generate from Islam itself. And there's many different things that we see and ideas that we see in ways of taking care of society. But most importantly, what it says is that there is this overlap. In Ramadan, he says Islam acknowledges the righteousness of non-Muslims, that in this case, people who aren't Muslim had defended justice and the oppressed. And lastly, he says that Islam, instead of building allegiance to a closed community, requires allegiance to a set of universal principles. The message of Islam is not a closed value system or at variance or conflict with other value systems. So when the people, they say that Islam, a person can't be fully committed to Islam or be a Muslim, fully committed Muslim, and also not be American at the same time, this story, this piece of what the Prophet ﷺ talked about before he became a prophet explains that yes, you can. And not only yes, you can, but ideas can be formulated and collaborated with as well. And Tariq Ramadan, he goes on towards the end of chapter 3, and he says that the Prophet's life itself before and after the beginning of revelation illustrates the relevance of the above analysis. The recognition of the moral qualities preceded his prophetic mission, which confirmed a posteriori the need for such qualities. So later on, when the people of Makkah fight the Prophet ﷺ and the Muslims and they don't accept him, it's not because they don't think he's the Prophet. There may be some. Many of them accepted that he was different and that he was special. But they did not like the things in society that would change. And that's why you saw from the earliest converts that they were often, they were poor, there were women, there were young people who came, and that the establishment of society about who would have power and who would have money would change. And so that's why they took offense with him. And he says, posteriori, which means from observation, that you see that this person was different. And even they themselves had said that he was different, that he was truthful and that he was relied upon for his evidence and his honesty beforehand, that they weren't surprised that the message should come to him. But in Ramadan, he says that in society, somebody who comes and wants to change things, then that person is not liked. And he talks about something called the Semmelweis reflex. Ignaz Semmelweis was a Hungarian doctor, and he was one of the first people when he observed in the hospitals. He observed in the hospitals that when surgeons, they washed their hands before performing surgery, there were fewer infections in the surgeries. Now, to us, that seems common sense. Of course, I'm going to wash my hand, but at that time, it wasn't common sense because we didn't know about the transfer of bacteria at that time. And especially, he says, when the people, when they assisted in if they needed to give birth with cesarean section, that if you wash your hands, there were fewer infant deaths. And so people told Semmelweis, nah, are you telling us that our hands are dirty and that we're dirty? And so he was ostracized in the community and he was kicked out. And of course, he was proven to be right. But what he did was he upset the system. In Ramadan, he's going to discuss in this next chapter, in chapter 4, that this was the reason why there were so few people who were told about the message in the beginning. That he knew that when this message was brought forth, that there would be opposition, that people would not like it, that people would disagree with it. And then the people who were part and had accepted it, they will be ostracized from the people that they love. And they would be ostracized from the home, the only home that they ever knew. And it's not like we are today, you know, you live in Portland one day and go to Seattle the next, or to Denver or wherever, but this was the only home that they knew. And their tribe and their clan was everything to them. And he knew that they would suffer. So in chapter 4, he talks about the revelation when it came to the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, and that the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam had spent time meditating about what it was that he was going to get closer, that to find this meaning that was going to fill him. And that whatever was offered at that time from the people didn't give him that completeness of being. And so every human being has that search for that, finding that something. And then so the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, he was trying to find it in that cave that he meditated in. What was that something? And when the revelation came down to him, he did not know what happened. Ramadan, he spent a lot of time in the book talking about why it is that Muslims have this connection with the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, because of his humanness of humanity, that he's a human being, like a person that we can relate to. When you read the epics, like we mentioned last time, the epic of Gilgamesh or Achilles or in the Odyssey or others, you have a person who's beyond anything, and you cannot relate to this person because the human qualities are not there. But the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, when he was given the first revelation, and it came down to him, it wasn't for him this moment that everything had changed, but he did not know what happened. And in the traditions, we're told that it had frightened him, because at that time, the people believed that people could become possessed. And this moment of what happened was of unsureness. And he went back to his wife, Khadija, and Khadija comforted him, and Khadija told him that God would not forsake you this way because you are the truthful. But he didn't know exactly how to take this. And then from there, that very first moment, or before that, when he was searching, Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, and he got that message, and it came down to him. And then through those 23 years of prophethood was this development. And that development is a metaphor and an analogous to our own spiritual journeys and paths, because we're always searching ourselves and trying to find that something that settles. And then sometimes the iman flows and sometimes it wanes. And then we look for those things. So in those 23 years, it was his own, that we relate to those moments, that some things were divinely guided and he was told what to do, and other things he had to on his own search for them and act. And Ramadan also, he mentions that there's this direct connection. And by the way, Tariq Ramadan, he has a great article on his website about science and the relation of science and Islam. So in Islam, in the generations of science that was created in the multiple different sciences, many people, there is an argument, it's an Orientalist argument, that Islam itself is the thing that prevents, this research or this. But we know from the past, because so many of the sciences were created, that that's not true. But he goes in and talks about how there is this direct relation and connection between knowledge and the acquisition of knowledge and then this faith. Because the very first thing that the Prophet ﷺ was told was "Iqra bismi rabbika alladhi khalaq," that you're going to read, and he could not read. He was unlettered. Most of the people at that time were unlettered, and yet he was told to read. And this connection of knowledge and faith were intertwined. Ramadan also has, those of you who work in Islamic education or teach, sometimes you teach a surah, and you have the beginning of the surah and you have the letters like Alif Lam Mim or Noon. And then so many people will ask, why is it there? And then so it's always difficult to have that answer for it. In Ramadan, he gives a very interesting answer. And he said, well, he doesn't have an answer, right? Because if it was an answer, it'd be given. We'd know about it. And so instead, what he does is that he says that there's always a limitation, and that acknowledging that limitation, that there is only certain things so far that I can be to gain this knowledge. And I can have affirmation about this knowledge. I can get so far, but there's a limit to it. And I can't go beyond that. But accepting that allows me to accept the fact that there are some things that maybe I can't know, but that there is faith in there. And so he goes on, it's a very interesting treatise about that. And then he goes into chapter 5. And in chapter 5, he discusses about the early years of the message and who the people receive that message. And so in the first 3 years of the prophethood, and the people, besides the first earliest people who had accepted, Khadija and the earliest of his companions, few people accepted in those 3 years. In those 3 years, there were only 30 to 40 people, depending on the narration, that had accepted of it. But the Prophet ﷺ, when before the proclamation, before the edict came down from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to proclaim publicly, the Prophet ﷺ knew that the quality was more important than the quantity, because he knew that these people who would be taught from the very beginning, they were the ones who were going to be the rock solid bedrock who were going to carry the message forward. And he also knew that those people who had accepted in the very beginning, and the trials that were to come about ostracization, about banishment, about facing from your own family and your own clan, that you were going to be boycotted. He knew that they would have to be resilient. And so it was the very, very few, that small group, when they used to meet in the house secretly of Al-Arqam ibn Al-Arqam, right? That small group, that those people, when they were taught how it was about the completeness of the faith, that they would have faith that the edicts would keep on coming down, the revelations would keep on coming down, and then complete everything. They accepted that. They accepted that it would take some time. So he concentrated on those few. And through those few people, he was able to change the worldview. So at the beginning, we talked about, look at the worldview that happened, that engendered the need for the Hilf al-Fudul, right? The need for that was because there was no overarching sense of justice. If my clan or my tribe could enforce it, then I would have that. The person who didn't pay the Yemeni merchant is because he didn't have to. No one could enforce it. But because you wanted these overarching, universal right and wrong, it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take time. And so the people who were going to profess it, they were the ones who were going to change this entire society. They were the ones who were going to face the Semmelweis reflex. And then they were the ones who were going to have to endure it. So it was a small quantity. And through changing the way that they looked at the world, this small group, this core, was able to change the way that their society looked at the world. And through that, they changed society. And then through that, the world changed. Small group of people, those first 3 years, and then up until the first 7 years, we will talk about until the boycott, and then the Hijra, and then 13 years, and then 100 years after that. Islam spread all around the known world at that time because it was from these few that could look at it and say, this is the way we want the world to be, because this is the way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants the world to be, in a perfect order, and everything a reason for it to be, why it's supposed to be that way, how we're supposed to connect with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so he gives a very beautiful description about this small group of people and then the mission that they had. He finishes his chapter 5 by talking about the 4 central axes of what was the central message before the proclamation became public. And he said, Tariq Ramadan talks about 4 different things. One was the oneness of God, this acceptance of this Tawheed. And then that was first and foremost. And if that could be accepted, then anything could be accepted. But once that's accepted, then that changes the view that you have on everything. I accept that one God, and I accept that there is no other God but He. Then if I accept that, then whatever revelations come down, I accept it. If I have to pray 5 times, then I have to pray 5 times. So in the early years, there weren't 5 prayers at that time, right? How many prayers were there in the very early years? There's only 2, right? And then if the revelation comes down that you don't drink, that's going to be accepted. If the revelation comes down that you must do this, then I accept it because I accepted the oneness of God. Then I accepted that He is the master of the universe. Then by reasoning, then I have to accept everything else because it doesn't make logical sense. If I accept the oneness of God and the right that this is the Lord of the universe, then all the other edicts that came in the revelation, if I don't accept it, doesn't make logical sense. And then Tariq Ramadan talks about the status of the Quran and that it would be preserved, and then that this was a direct communication from God. And that is not anything that's taken lightly. For the people at that time, the direct conversation that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would communicate directly with human beings in exactly the way that He wanted, and exactly in the way that He had already chosen that He was going to communicate with human beings through this Quran and this elevated status of it. In Ramadan, he mentions that this was meant to be exactly as it was. The verses were meant to come down in the order that they came down. The events were meant to happen exactly as they happened. And that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows everything that's going to happen before it was. And He also knows the things that weren't, if they were to be, He'd know how they'd go as well. So the Quran and that its establishment of this direct communication and the miracle of it was impressed upon in those first few early years. And then our connection of the prayer and the salah. And this is also something that's impressed upon in this first few years of the message. And then that is different from the way that the people have prayed before. But this is going to be that conduit this time. And the times that we're going to be spread out, we're also going to be split up that way. And finally, the last thing and the final thing of today's lecture is about life after death, that there would be life after death, that whatever happened and whatever we did, that there would be a reckoning of it. And then that if there is a life after death, then some of the things that do not make sense to people, and some things we can, but the fact that there is a life after death changes those things. Because regardless of what happens to anybody, we know that the life after death is infinite. And then that the life after death being infinite, that everything would be sorted out. the injustices of this world, because this world is imperfect and there are injustices, that the afterlife and life after death in complete perfect harmony with God's will would completely take into those things account. And that the people who did not believe that at that time, that was difficult for them, that there would be a life after that. We know the story of Abu Lahab, the paternal uncle of the Prophet ﷺ, and that the famous story about him when the Prophet ﷺ, we talk about next time, when the message was publicly declared, that Abu Lahab, he looked at his two hands and said, you know, if I can't see this, here, give this to me. He refuses to accept that of what he can't see, of what's not there. And this was something that was central to the ethos at that time, and something that when the revelation came, changed it. And so this was the last of the 4 axes that Ramadan talks about, was central at that society. So at that point, I'm going to stop and see if there are any questions. Well, thank you so much for joining in and joining us here tonight. And inshallah, we'll do the final leg